Hello, everybody.
Hey, Stanley.
Good to go. Thank you so much to everyone joining us here, whether you're joining on Zoom or joining us through our YouTube live stream. I really appreciate everyone being here. I'll give some just very brief opening logistical remarks and introduce Vinnie Schiraldi, and then we'll jump right in. So I'm Kendra Bradner. I direct our probation and parole reform project at the Columbia Justice Lab, and I'll be your MC for this afternoon. I'd like to share just a very brief but also very sincere thank you to the co-sponsors of today's event. So A More Just NYC, the New York State Bar Association and its task force on the parole system, and the American Bar Association's criminal justice section. A special welcome to folks who found your way to today's conversation through one of those groups. I'll turn it over now to Vincent Schiraldi, who's co-director of the Columbia Justice Lab, to introduce today's keynote speaker. Go ahead, Vinnie.
Thank you, Kendra, and welcome everyone. I'm really excited today has come and that we're able to partner with the Independent Commission, State Bar Association, and the American Bar Association's Criminal Justice panel on today's important event. New York State is to be embarrassed by our work in parole, both by how many people we return to prison for technical violations of their parole, but also by our failure to help them when they return home from prison, thrive and live the kinds of life we want for anybody. We'd want for our own son or daughter if they were returning home from prison. And hopefully today's panelists will do a much better job of discussing that than I have. But it's at my absolute pleasure to introduce the Honorable Jonathan Lippman, former Chief Judge of New York and Chief Judge of the New York Court of Appeals, the state's highest court. He's of counsel in the New York office of Latham and Watkins, and he served as Chief Judge from 2009 through 2015, where he championed equal access to justice in New York and around the country, and took a leadership role in identifying permanent funding streams for civil legal services. Judge Lippman made New York the first state in the country to require 50 hours of law-related pro bono work prior to bar admission, and established the pro bono Scholars in Poverty Justice Solutions programs to help alleviate the crisis in legal services for the poor. In the criminal justice arena, Judge Lippman strengthened the state's indigent criminal defense system, addressed the systemic causes of wrongful convictions, created human trafficking courts across New York State, and led efforts to reform New York's juvenile justice, bail, and pretrial justice system. He's presently, as I mentioned, chair of the Independent Commission on New York City Criminal Justice and Incarceration Reform, which is co-sponsoring this event with us. They have been leaders in efforts to close the Rikers Island jail. Don't know if folks out there know it, but I've been named this week by Mayor de Blasio to become Commissioner of New York City's Department of Corrections. So I will now be picking that report up, rereading it, dusting it off, and trying to implement as much of it as I can in the time I have allotted to me. So I want to just thank Judge Lippman and turn it over to him. Thank you very much, Your Honor.
Thank you, Vinnie, and for the kind words, and to the American Bar Association, the New York State Bar, and the Columbia University Justice Lab for sponsoring this important event. I also want to specifically note the work that Vinnie and his team at Columbia have done on parole, which has galvanized really efforts to reform parole in New York and across the country, and help guide my own and so many others' thinking on these vital issues. Vinny, also congratulations on your appointment as Commissioner of the New York City Department of Corrections. You certainly are running towards the fire, Vinny, and we are all rooting for you. There aren't many jobs that are more difficult or more important, and I have every confidence that you, from personal experience, that you will contribute greatly to the cause of justice in our city and state. What a fabulous appointment by the mayor. Many of you have heard me talk frequently about the concept of justice, and more particularly equal justice, and how we make this ideal real and concrete for those who interact with the justice system on a daily basis. As chief judge, it was my job to think about how to achieve justice every day, not only in terms of the individual cases that came before our Court of Appeals, but more broadly in terms of the laws and practices that prevail in the criminal justice arena. Equal justice is at the core not only of our justice system, but also of our society. And far too often, we fail to live up to our hopes and aspirations in seeking to ensure that the scales of Lady Justice are exquisitely and evenly balanced. The challenge is, how can we make justice about fairness and the rights and liberties of individuals, and not about the amount of money in a person's pocket or the color of their skin? In this regard, we are here today to speak about the parole system, and specifically the alarming rate at which people who are on parole, particularly of those in our Black and brown communities and with limited resources, are sent back to jail and prison for parole violations, often for allegations of non-criminal technical violations. As we will discuss, this clearly is an area where we are not living up to the imperative of equal justice in any meaningful way. People who are leaving prison after serving their time face serious, serious challenges. They often have few, if any, resources to rely on. In New York City, half of the people leaving prison go directly to our city's dormitory homeless shelters, a difficult, often chaotic setting that does nothing to support a person's efforts to rebuild his or her life in our communities. Access to stable housing, access to economic opportunity, access to health care. These critical needs are hard to come by. Yet rather than focusing on meeting these needs, we have a set of parole rules that too often become tripwires that send people back to jail and then prison before they can take meaningful steps towards rehabilitation. Jail and prison are immensely expensive, but ironically, they are the only resource that we freely provide. When people on parole are accused of breaking a parole condition, perhaps by missing appointments with a parole officer, or missing curfew, or failing drug tests, or deciding to leave a shelter to stay somewhere else without their parole officer's approval, they are automatically sent to jail while the allegations are litigated in an administrative process. People who are accused of these non-criminal acts have no chance to go before a judge to seek release or even to post bail, unlike people charged with even the most serious criminal offenses. Here in New York City, they spend weeks and often months under traumatic, almost dangerous conditions, often dangerous conditions, back at Rikers. And the racial disparities that we see throughout our justice system are especially pronounced when it comes to parole. For those of us invested in the fairness of New York's criminal justice system, parole reform must be at the top of the list. Yet for decades, parole has been far from a priority for policymakers, the media, and advocacy groups. It has flown under the radar for far, far too long. This is incomprehensible, given the visibility of the problem here and throughout the country. Nationwide, there are 4.4 million people on parole and other forms of community supervision, such as probation. a phenomenon that some have described as mass supervision that parallels and perpetuates the American system of mass incarceration and the warehousing of human beings out of sight and out of mind. Here in New York State, we have 35,000 people on parole on any given day, roughly as many as are in prison. And each year, a staggering 40% of the people admitted to New York State prisons are sent there for parole violations, not new felony convictions. This is truly remarkable and unsettling, to say the least. Why is it that parole has received so little attention? I think the answer is obvious. As a society, we too often ignore those who have been convicted and sent to prison. We prefer not to think about them, to forget about them, ourselves forgetting that nearly everyone who enters prison, even the most serious offenses, will someday come home to our communities, our families. In reality, their ability to reintegrate, to reconnect, to rebuild their lives has a powerful impact, for better or for worse, on families and communities across our city, state, and nation. Thankfully, there is a growing awareness of the importance of parole as a driving force behind the overuse of jail and prison and the victimization of human beings who desperately need a helping hand. Researchers and advocates are finally training their attention on parole. Philanthropic institutions are increasingly putting their money behind reform efforts. And many states have already started to make critical changes intended to limit incarceration for parole violation. Here in New York, we like to think of ourselves as leaders in criminal justice. We do have a lower rate of incarceration than most states, and we have caught up to other states by raising the age. We also have passed bail and discovery reforms that have altered the pretrial landscape and helped put our state at the forefront of national efforts to end cash bail. While those pretrial reforms have proven controversial in some quarters, and I don't agree with them in every aspect, there is no doubt in my mind that they represent a giant leap forward towards justice. And I would note as an aside that there is no evidence or data that suggests that these reforms have been responsible for the challenge of increased shootings that we have seen in New York City and in cities across the country amidst the devastation of the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet when it comes to parole, New York is dead last in the nation. We incarcerate more people for parole rule violations than any other state in the country, with Black people sent to prison for parole violations at 5 times the rate of white people. And the percentage of people who go to prison each year in New York for a parole violation is 3 times the national average. For every person sent on parole who is convicted of a felony, another 5 people are sent to prison for rules violations, and almost 3/4 of the people on parole are returned to prison, the vast majority of whom are locked up for rules violation. All of this is an absolutely massive failure for our state and a flashing red light that people in New York State, that parole in New York State is not operating as it should. Beyond that, putting parolees back in jail has a tremendous impact on people, families, and communities, wiping out any progress that they've made since coming home, setting them back to square one. In addition to these very real human costs, the financial costs are also tremendous. In 2019, New York state and local governments collectively spent more than $680 million to incarcerate people on parole for rules violation. Doesn't make any sense. What's more, there is no evidence whatsoever that this massive expenditure of resources is keeping us safe, which is why parole reform in New York is supported by district attorneys, not only here in New York City, but upstate and in Long Island, as well as by sheriffs, former law enforcement officials, and the state and city bar association. The system as it exists today is counterproductive for all who are involved, and that includes parole officers, who by no means should be blamed for the system's failing. To the contrary, They have a very tough job and they have been set up to fail. They have high caseloads and limited resources. They have little in the way of housing opportunities, options, job opportunities, or educational opportunities to provide to the people that they are supposed to help and supervise. Instead, their only unlimited resource is jail, which in almost all cases is not helpful. And then we turn around and blame them when something goes wrong. Is it any wonder that incarcerating people for technical violations becomes the default? But despite all these challenges, there is cause for hope. There are good reasons to believe that change is afoot. As mentioned, policymakers, advocates, and philanthropists have started to take note of the hidden but outsized role that parole has in driving incarceration in New York and across the country. And states where you least expect it have begun to change their parole systems with promising reforms that we can build on here in New York. Many of these are red states, which generally take more punitive approaches towards criminal justice than we do. Yet, from Alaska to Arizona to Arkansas, South Dakota to South Carolina, even Louisiana, these more conservative states have taken steps to reform parole. The results, incarceration and costs have dropped, and criminal offenses by people on parole either decreased or remained flat, debunking the idea that locking people up for technical violations was needed for public safety. Further, caseloads have dropped so the parole officers can finally focus on these people with the greatest needs. Throughout the country, at least 18 states have established good time credits for people on parole that allow them to shorten their term of supervision through good behavior. 24 states have shifted to a system of graduated sanctions for technical violations, limiting jail terms to more serious and repeated issues. And 16 states have capped the length of time that people can be incarcerated for technical violations, promoting accountability and proportionality. All of this points the way towards a better system here in New York and proves that reform can work. There is no excuse for New York, the Empire State, not to be the leader when it comes to parole, as we are in so many other areas. That brings me to the less is more legislation that has been introduced in Albany. This is our best promise for the future. It builds on the reforms in other states and would do many good things here in New York. The legislation would encourage positive behavior through earned time credits. 30 days of compliance with parole rules would earn 30 days off a parole term. It would stop automatically sending people who were accused of parole violations to jails like Rikers. And it would reduce the types of rules violations and minor offenses that could send people on parole back to jail or prison. Reforms like these would also lower parole officer caseloads so that they can focus on helping people reintegrate in society and surely increase public safety. And they will save money, real money, hundreds of millions of dollars that is currently spent on jail and prison for people on parole. Money that can be redirected towards much more productive uses. And I find it particularly encouraging that parole reform is supported by a wide and unique coalition, not just criminal justice professionals of all stripes, but many community groups from across the state, the Association of Counties, and so many others. There is hope on the horizon. The fact that we are all here focused on these issues is itself a very, very good sign. On that positive note, it's time to hear from the real experts, today's panelists, who have such a depth of experience and knowledge on this very important and pressing set of issues that hold the promise of reform that can contribute so greatly to our ultimate goal, making the ideal of equal justice a reality each and every day here in New York. That's what this is all about. I look forward to working together with them and all of you toward that end. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Judge Lippman, and for kicking us off in such a wonderful way. I'll invite our first panelist to turn on your cameras so that others can see you. And there we go, as folks join in. I'm going to give just a very brief introduction to our first panel's moderator, Seymour W. James Jr. And in the interest of time and to get us straight into the panel discussion, as Judge Lippman indicated, I'm going to be very brief. And I just want to make sure that we're, there we go, that you can see me. Seymour is I'm just going to list a handful of his many roles and accomplishments in this brief introduction. So Seymour is a partner at the law firm of Barkett, Epstein, Kieran, Aldea, and Laturco, focused on criminal defense and civil rights litigation. He has served in several roles with distinction, including as the former attorney-in-chief of the Legal Aid Society in New York City, and as past president of the New York State Bar Association. Especially relevant for today's discussion, he currently serves as co-chair of the State Bar's Task Force on the Parole System, and Seymour has also served on several important state and city commissions and is the recipient of a number of awards for achievement and extraordinary commitment to the legal profession. He's a graduate of Brown University and Boston University School of Law. Thank you so much for moderating this discussion, Seymour. I'll turn it over to you and just make sure that everyone can see you. I'm just going to bring everyone in. There we go.
I think I've been connected now.
Perfect. Sorry about that, Seymour.
Okay, that's okay. Okay. Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Kendra. You know, before I introduce the other panelists, I just want to tell you a little bit about the Task Force on the Parole System that I was privileged to co-chair at the State Bar, and give you a brief summary of our findings. There really is little or no evidence that the current revocation process for technical parole violations enhances public safety or reduces recidivism. In fact, there's actually a stronger argument that incarcerating people for technical parole violations plays a negative role in integrating people back into the community, and it's extremely costly in human and economic terms. So some of our recommendations were to eliminate the authority to issue warrants for people who are only charged with technical parole violations, and instead give them a notice of violation telling them to appear. If in fact a warrant ultimately has to be issued because they deliberately fail to respond, that they have to be brought before a criminal court within 24 hours for the court to make an assessment as to whether they should be released. And then also to reduce incarceration for the adjudicated technical parole violations and reincarcerate people only when the alternatives to incarceration have been fully exhausted. And that graduated sanctions should be imposed, starting with community-based drug treatment, mental health or cognitive behavioral treatment programs, and then limit time assessments to no more than 30 days of intermittent, or sometimes intermittent sentences. And then reinvest the cost savings in community-based